So this is going to be a review of Chapter 14 material, specifically Lecture 18, and we're just going to run through this really fast and make like a very summarized, condensed note page of everything we need to know from this lecture. So this is the order that we're going to go through: nervous system, neurons and synapses, glial cells, and myelination. So the nervous system has two parts. It has a central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So I like to draw it like this. I draw a dashed line, and then I write central nervous system and peripheral nervous system like this, right? And that's just because they are structural differences. And what that means is in the central nervous system, you have the brain and you have the spinal cord. And then in the peripheral nervous system, you have things like cranial nerves, which I'll just write as CN. You have spinal nerves. And then you also have ganglia. Now, I get a lot of questions about, like, what actually are ganglia, right? Well, ganglia, I think of, like, the word gang reminds me of, like, you're hanging out with your pals and you've got a little powwow going on. And basically, this is just a place where cell bodies will kind of get together. And we'll talk about that in a little while. But those are the two divisions. And so if we keep this in mind, that these are what makes the structural divisions, then there are also functional differences between these two. So let's draw something like this. So here we have our central nervous system again. I'm going to draw a dashed line, peripheral nervous system. Now, information that goes to the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system is going to sense information, perceive information, it's going to sense and gather, and then it's going to send it to the central nervous system to say, like, hey, what are we going to do about this? That's where it will be perceived and interpreted. And this information that goes to it is referred to as afferent, right? And then after the central nervous system, it receives this information, it's like, all right, now we're going to do something about it. So then it's going to then tell the peripheral nervous system, hey, act in this way. And that is efferent. Somewhat an easy way to remember that. A lot of people do E for exiting. It's exiting the central nervous system, right? So then from here, you also have multiple divisions of like how you collect information, right? So this is known as the sensory nervous system here because it's sensing. This is a sensory nervous system. And when you affect something, that's going to be your motor nervous system, like that. But there are two ways that you can sense information. Okay, there are two ways you can sense information. And then there are also two ways that you can affect. So let's start with sensory, right? The first one is you can consciously perceive it. This is known as somatic sensory. Somatic sensory. This is conscious. You're consciously aware. So the example of this is going to be like your five senses. You're aware of those things. You're aware of you're touching something, or you're smelling something, or you see something. You are consciously aware of that. So that's part of your somatic sensory. Then you have visceral sensory. Okay? And this is going to be the opposite, right? The not conscious or unconscious. Right, so those are two ways that you can receive information from the peripheral nervous system, send it to the central nervous system. Then when the central nervous system interprets, it thinks about it, and it's like, all right, now let's do something about it. Then it's going to go through the motor nervous system. The motor nervous system has two main things here. This first one is going to be your somatic again. So, but this is going to be your somatic motor. See how over here it was somatic sensory? This is going to be somatic motor. And this is really important because this is voluntary. So these were conscious and unconscious because it was sensory, but these are going to be voluntary and involuntary. And this other one is going to be your autonomic motor. Okay. The example of a voluntary somatic motor is skeletal muscle. You have complete voluntary control. You have the choice of whether you move your arm or you don't. Then involuntary, your autonomic, That is going to be things like cardiac muscle contracting, smooth muscle, so we can just write like the heart, and we can say, you know, let's say smooth muscle also. Smooth. Right. So that's a basic breakdown of what you want to understand about the nervous system as a whole. Right? So we talked about the nervous system. Now neurons and synapses. This is just a brief review. Here's a neuron. This is the main cell that makes up the nervous system. You have cell body, which is also known as the soma. Let me see if I'll zoom in here. So we have the cell body, which is also known as the soma. And then these have dendrites, and they have little spines in them called dendritic spines. The axon hillock is where the soma meets the axon. The axon is the long hallway where a signal will be propagated. Here is an axon collateral. Think of like collateral damage. It's like something in addition to. So it's just like an additional axon here that maybe came from another neuron. And then we have myelin sheath, which is the fatty insulating wrapping around the axon. That's to speed up a signal. If you had multiple of these myelin sheaths on the axon, the spaces between them would be called the nodes of Ranvier. Then you also have your axon terminals, or your terminal arborizations is another way to be referred to that. And then you have your synaptic knobs at the end. And then a signal will be released, a neurotransmitter will be released from there. Right? So those are neurons, and that's how they synapse, right? Because they just attach to one another. Now glial cells. Glial cells, so there are two types of cells in the nervous system. There's the neuron, which was what we just talked about here, and then there are other cells, glial cells, that are really important too. Here's how I like to think about glial cells. All right. So this is going to be about glial cells. In the central nervous system, there are certain glial cells, and in the peripheral nervous system, there are certain glial cells. In the central nervous system, there are 4. Oopsies. 3, 4. And in the peripheral nervous system, there are only 2. Right away, when I'm writing these down, peripheral nervous system, I always put an S and an S here. And that's because the 2 glial cells in this peripheral nervous system are satellite glial cells and Schwann cells. Okay, so we'll talk about their functions in just a minute. So let's go back over here to the central nervous system. The first one I like to start with is the first letter of the alphabet. So it is going to be your astrocyte. Now, don't write yourself full, complete notes about the details of all these things that they do, but just write yourself a quick little note, and that way you make a recall and you make the connection as to what this is. So the first letter in the alphabet is A. The next letter that comes after A is B, and I always write B, B, B. This stands for blood-brain barrier, which is protecting the brain. So think about this. The brain is really important, and the way that hormones and other nutrients are transferred around the body are through the blood system, right? Through blood vessels. Well, the brain wants to kind of be selfish and be very protective over what blood and what things it does allow in and out of the brain. So essentially, if you picture you have a blood vessel here that's in the brain, it wants to be really protected, and when it's open like this, anything can come in and out. So this astrocyte is basically going to come in like this, and it's going to take it's going to project out and kind of camouflage and cover up this blood vessel like this. So that way less things can come in and out. These little feet are called perivascular feet, and now it's a lot harder to get in and out of this blood vessel. So that's the whole job of the astrocyte, is it creates this blood-brain barrier, right? This is the barrier. It's reaching out, it has these little perivascular feet, and it just kind of suction cups on this blood vessel and is really protective of what goes in and out. Okay, the next one is that I like to think of. These are in no particular order, by the way, just how I think about them. Ependymal. So this is CSF, which we know is cerebrospinal fluid, and this cell produces and circulates cerebrospinal fluid. And how it looks like is this. Here you have a cell, right? And then it has these little projections here, And what happens is inside this cell is CSF is going to be produced, and it's going to push it out here, and then these little microvilli are going to, cilia are then going to push the fluid along. So then when you have a cavity, so when you have multiple of these cells lined up together, right, these are all epidermal cells, they're all producing something, and then it needs to go this way, so they're all gonna like move it along. So CSF, what about it? It's producing it and circulating it. So just a quick little note about that. The next one I like to think of is microglial. Think micro, like kind of sort of important, but nobody really cares that much. Microglial are M for mobile, so they are mobile. And these ones I think of like the janitors, right? Really important, but like, do you care that much? Not really. These microglial cells are going to go through and they're going to engulf debris. So they're just going to kind of clean up. They're the behind-the-scenes worker of this whole system. The last one here is an oligodendrocyte. This is responsible for producing myelin. So let's jump over here to we'll talk more about this in just a second. Peripheral nervous system, satellite. These ones really you just need to know that it's just going to regulate fluid. Not a super important one. Regulate fluid, and this is going to be around the somas, which if you remember, somas also means cell body. Schwann cells also produce myelin, right? So what's the difference here? There's a really important distinction between an oligodendrocyte, which is in the central nervous system, and a Schwann cell, which is in the peripheral nervous system. The difference is how they myelinate things. You're going to want to think of O as octopus and S as cellfish. Let's talk about this. Here we have an axon, which we know is part of our neuron. This oligodendrocyte sits off similar to the astrocyte, which we saw up here. But this oligodendrocyte's like an octopus, and it's going to extend its little feet, and it's going to myelinate, okay? And it can do this multiple times. And it also, so this is the one cell here, this smiley face is one cell. This is one oligodendrocyte. And if there were another axon over here, it could also reach over and myelinate that. So it's able to myelinate many things, like an octopus has many legs, versus a Schwann cell is selfish. One cell only myelinates, only creates one myelin sheath. So if there was an axon here, and here you have like your myelin, right? That is one cell right there. I just drew the cell body. So if we drew another one, another Schwann cell, here's your myelin, here's the cell body. It only makes itself. So S equals selfish, which in this case means one cell for one myelin. Myelin. Versus an oligodendrocyte is like an octopus, and it can do many axons or many myelin on the same axon. Okay? So that's glial cells, and that's also myelination. And there was a couple of slides about like how things myelinate. Basically just keeps wrapping around and around and around like a lollipop.